Welcome back, everyone, to more NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's setup video is all about the Xtreme Dirt Tour. We're going to be visiting the dirt track at Charlotte. So this track is more of a flatter style track, more of a bull ring style, so you really have to work hard on the handling. The keys here are to make sure you run your line and don't have the car sliding around too much, because the more the sliding you do, the more speed you scrub off. So as much fun as it is to slide these cars around, you have to keep that to a minimum in order to keep your momentum and ultimately make lap time. We're going to be talking about the setup itself. We're going to be talking about lap times. And of course, if you haven't already seen it, I released a little bit earlier today a gameplay video for this track, a 25 lap race against the maximum difficulty AI. So be sure to check that out. But for now, let's take a look at the setup. Before we hop into the setup discussion itself, let's talk a little bit about lap times. My quickest laps are in the 14.7 range. Most of the laps are 14.8, 14.9. That's in clear track if I'm really trying to hustle the car. Of course, you spend nearly all of your time in these races in traffic, so lap times are not really important. The most important thing is to have a setup that is controllable, something that is consistent, and the importance then moves to your driving style and being able to drive smooth and consistent laps and being able to drive the car in multiple grooves, because you'll need to use both the very bottom of the track all the way up to the top of the track at different times to navigate through traffic. Let's go ahead and start by discussing the shocks. Again, discussing shocks is well beyond what we're trying to do in this particular video. I'll just simply let you know that this is what works for me. This smooths out the bumps to the point that most of the time I forget they're even there. Okay, let's move on to the weight settings. Of course, we want maximum left side weight, and then our front weight and wedge are really used along with some other options that we'll see to control the rotation of the car. One of the things we want to do is we want to have the car to rotate, particularly on entry and through the center of the corner, but we don't want it to over-rotate. Over-rotation leads to a loss of speed. It's a ton of fun to drive it that way and to really hang the rear end out, but it's not all that fast from my experience. So we'll be using the front weight and wedge to control the rotation of the car. And of course, as always, this is dependent on your driving style. But for the way I drive the car, and again, take a look at that gameplay video that I'll link in the description below, and you can hear how I work the throttle and how I steer the car, so to give you a better idea of just how I drive the car into and off the corners. Moving on to the springs, a stiff spring setup. And I say stiff because, again, it's a relative term, but these are some of the stiffest springs that you can get in the car. 280 pounds per inch is the maximum spring that you can have. And I want a little bit stiffer left front spring than right front, just to help with the entry. If you're finding that you're not getting into the corner quite as good, there are some really, I think, better ways of getting the car to rotate than adjusting the front springs, but that's always an option. Again, it's all based on the feel and how you drive the car. In the rear of the car, I'm using 220 pounds on the left rear, 260 in the right rear. Now, this is an area that I do use among the different tracks to adjust the rotation of the car. If I feel like the rear end is dominating too much, particularly from the entry through the center, then I will lower the rear springs, both in conjunction. And then if I feel like the rear end is really not doing enough work, the car's not rotating enough, then I will increase the rear springs again together. So meaning that if I went up to 230 pounds on the left rear spring, I would go up to 270 pounds on the right rear spring, and just sort of keep those. Once you find a good split between the left rear and right rear that helps the car rotate from the center off, then you're in good shape, and I like to keep with that spread in the rear springs. Moving over to the tires, 22, 23 pounds on the left sides, and then I run the maximum 30 pounds on the right sides. That seems to work out well. I don't worry too much about the temperature spread on the tires. I'm more interested in grip and lap time. Miscellaneous settings. The camber is maxed out on both the left front and right front at +5 degrees left front, -5 degrees right front. Front sway bar is at 1.1. No rear sway bar, although that is certainly an option. It's just not something I prefer to use for my driving style. Track bar, 14 inches, so way up there. That is a very high track bar setting, but I use this again to help the car rotate. It really helps to get the rear end turned, particularly in the center of the corner, so that I can get the car pointed in the direction I want for the exit. This is one of those easy settings that if you find that the car is too loose, then simply lower the track bar on both sides, and that will help you out. The brake bias, I feel like anywhere between 45 and 55 works pretty good for me. The lower you get that setting, the more the car will want to rotate when you're on the brakes. And I don't use the brakes under normal conditions when I'm in clear track, but if I'm in heavy traffic, sometimes I will use the brake just a little bit to help rotate the car, particularly if I'm running the bottom. I don't use any grill tape. Grill tape matters zero amount in this game, unfortunately, as long as you don't get it too much and get the oil temperature. But unfortunately, it doesn't do what it does in real life, so I, for the most part, ignore it, particularly on the dirt cars. Wheel lock, I have used anywhere between 10 and 15 degrees on that. The higher setting simply makes the wheels steer quicker. So if you want a quicker response to your steering inputs, then simply increase this number. And finally, the steering offset is at 0.05, and that's just to offset some of the pull to the left from our camber number. If you need the car, if it's still pulling too hard to the left, simply increase the steering offset. And finally, the gear settings. There are only 2 gears in this car, so ignore 3rd and 4th gear. And I'm using a rear end ratio for this track of 5.00. Now you can get by with actually multiple different rear end settings, and the gear you use will really, once again, like everything else, depend on how you drive the car. You can go up a little bit to a 5.14 or higher, or you can go down to a 4.86, maybe even lower, again, just depending on how you want to drive the car. The higher the number you use on the gear, the more RPMs you will turn, and the looser the car will tend to be on exit and particularly on throttle. So that takes care of the dirt track at Charlotte. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hopefully some of this you found useful, if not the setup itself, because that is very setup or driver dependent, but maybe you found some of the discussion helpful. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more as we continue our NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming.